All right, hello everyone. It is Thursday, September 9th. My name is Drew Sukup, and on behalf of VMUG, I'd like to welcome you to today's Blumira webcast, 5 VMware Carbon Black detections to prevent ransomware, presented by Matthew Warner, CTO and co-founder of Blumira. Thank you for participating in today's webcast and for your continued support in the global VMUG program. Before we begin, I have 3 quick housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webcast will be recorded and available for you on demand. You'll receive an email with the on-demand link, so keep an eye out for that. Second, a Q&A session will follow today's presentation if we still have time. All questions will need to be entered into the question and answer section on the side. And please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. We love to answer questions throughout. Matthew and I were just talking about it. Come on, hit us with your best shot. We got this, all right? Try to stump us. Third, there'll be a short online evaluation that pops up as you exit the webcast. Please take a minute and let us know what you thought of today's session and what you might like to see going forward. All attendees from today's webcast who opted in their information at registration will be entered into a raffle to win a $100 Amazon gift card. The winner will be contacted directly by Blumira. So good luck. All right, well, we're not here for me. We're here for Blumira, so let's get started. Matthew, I'll turn it over to you now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Drew, for that great intro. It's great to talk to everyone today. And here we are to talk about 5 VMware Carbon Black detections, or VMware endpoint, or we'll go over a bit of the naming conventions to prevent ransomware. And this will be probably more around detection families, but we'll run through it. And by all means, as you heard Drew say there, please ask any and all questions as we're going through this. I'd like to make sure that you all get as much as you're looking for out of this, as I'm happy to ramble at people. And again, I am Matthew Warner. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Blumira. And what Blumira is a cloud SIEM. In many ways, we are a log aggregation and threat detection provider. So we pull in a lot of data, and we look through that data, and we determine what's bad. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today here. And really a lot of what we're seeing, which I'm sure you all are seeing as well, is that there's a problem in the security in the IT world right now. And it's not necessarily that there is inherently a rise in attacks, but there's a rise in attacks that are impacting us in ways that 5 years ago when WannaCry was just starting, or 10 years ago when we were really just looking at these ad hoc attacks that weren't really impacting us in ways that ransomware is now, we're seeing a rise in these attacks that we have to kind of sit down and say, all right, it's impacting us in ways that the upper level of these organizations really need to consider what the maturity of our organization is. How can we get more mature from a defensive security and detection point of view? And how can we leverage these technologies, like the ones we're going to be talking about today, into a way that allows us to be more secure, get better visibility, and be able to stop the thing that in many ways at this point feels like it should just not be named, but ransomware, where we're trying to come up with those ways to best defend our environments against these ransomware, these breaches, and how to get better visibility across all of them. And of course, it's a problem that I'm sure will just never go away and will keep growing, which is, of course, the way that IT and InfoSec grows. Defense improves, offense improves a little faster, and we all have to kind of grow together. And it becomes a very interesting dance, we'll call it. And it's one of the main reasons that Blumira has pushed in the direction it has, is we want to give people a way to best detect. And that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today. So real quick, I just want to go over some of the stages of an attack, because we're going to be talking about different pieces of these as we go through over the next 40, 50, 60 minutes. So discovery is, of course, really important across the attacker's point of view. And in many cases, this could just be determining what your organization is. It could be determining what email addresses are out there within that environment. And they may just be kind of determining where and how they can get to your environment. That could be shooting a phishing email in the case of ransomware, or it could be looking for exposed endpoints in your DMZ. So we're talking about from a endpoint point of view, it could be your RDP servers that are on your DMZ, which we never recommend doing, but we also know it happens a lot. Or it could be your VPN servers, or something that's less controllable through an endpoint, where more you're looking at what is the best way to kind of defend my external face. And that's a lot of what discovery is from the standpoint of the attack. When we're talking about gaining a foothold, that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. Gaining a foothold, escalating privileges, executing those files. How can the attacker actually get into that environment, perform something that allows them to get further into it, either through persistence, lateral movement, just being able to actually move further and get those stages into your either endpoints or your servers so they can start to take control of your environment. And of course, being able to execute files, exfiltrate data, and deploy your ransomware. These days, it's going to be a 50-50 shot in regard to how ransomware is going to land in your environment. We see it go both ways, and we have seen it go both ways, which is to say, it's either going to be a situation where someone kind of is able to drop in and get access, and they're just going to BitLocker your entire environment, and which does not require malware necessarily, and they're not going to exfiltrate data realistically. They're just going to take down your environment and drop a note. Versus the other types of organizations where you see more in the news, which is to say, they got ransomware in, they were probably there for a good period of time, they had that foothold for probably weeks to months. During that time period, they were able to exfiltrate data, usually using rclone, which we'll touch on again a little later. And then that data would then be able to be used by the attackers as a kind of source to blackmail you into having to pay them, which is always one of those situations of that new kind of worse world that we've entered into of, well, you know what we could also do? We could take the data and just promise to release it, which is always just a fun new thing to get into. And of course, deploying ransomware, which in some cases, if you have strong EDR visibility and they're using BitLocker, there could be a situation where you're able to recover the keys used even. There's always a benefit to getting deeper and deeper visibility into your environment to just view across the stages of these attacks, because realistically, at the very least, and the gain foothold down to deploy, there's always things that you can see and view at the EDR level for these kind of attacks. So we're going to start out with commonly used malicious file names, file types. Generally speaking, if we're going to be talking about the phishing side, spear phishing, however they're getting into the environment from the standpoint of your users, it's going to involve something coming from an Office document, usually a doc or docx. At times, it could be a related executable file, which are always worth monitoring. But generally speaking, these days, especially with the CVE that came out in the last few days, which I'm going to talk about as well, you're really going to be seeing more issues around docx, macros being triggered, still a very common way to gain foothold from a ransomware perspective. Or in the case of this new CVE associated with ActiveX, all that's really required is for a person to open the document and remove from protected mode and move into edit mode. The moment that protected mode is dropped off, the ActiveX applet is executed, and then the attacker is able to gain a foothold at that point. So a lot of what we're seeing is really a focus around those docx. And of course, there's always the weird ones like the cab files or any sort of executable that people can kind of drop in on you. It's always important to do some amount of user training. We always recommend that. However, it's also important to recognize that users will never be able to defend this for themselves. It's just not possible. It's not really their fault that they can't do it. It's just really kind of not understandable for a lot of end users to be able to comprehend, like, you need to validate every single thing that hits your inbox. So it's always important from a defensive point of view and from a visibility point of view that we're thinking about how can we see these things, which do people actually need and use, and what's in our environment, which is to say, if you know that everyone in your environment is using a modern Win word, if they're all using Word from the last 4 years, there would be almost never a situation where a .doc needs to be opened. So getting visibility into that alone is important. But it's also on the hindsight, and I also will state that you have the situations like this new CVE for ActiveX, you'll never see it come in a .doc. You'll always see it come in a docx because it requires that remote template component that Windows, for some reason, decided it should be as insecure as possible, which is a much longer conversation we can get into if anyone would like. Many ransomware strains across the board use Word documents as their initial entrance point. There are situations where RDP is used, and we see that pretty commonly. There are also situations what we see on and off where an attacker will use out-of-date VPNs at the DMZ to gain access. And usually when that happens, This is a good thing that I always recommend everyone check, though this is unrelated to VMware Carbon Black. If you are using a VPN at your DMZ, and it's always difficult to stay up to date, so like Pulse Secure is a great example. They had a 0-day that came out, and people were exploiting it within 2 days. It's really, really hard to just kind of be ready to go. And if you can, and you are, that's spectacular, but not everyone is. One of the tidbits that I'll drop on this is, however you bind to your Radius server, if you're using RadiusOff, ensure that you're not using an account that's credentialed or permissioned. We've seen it happen a number of times where an attacker will drop into a VPN that is out of date. They're able to leverage that to get access, or at least get credentials, and then move into the environment. So always recommend checking what you're using for bind to bind to your authentication server. So back to the EDR side of the world of Carbon Black and VMware, it's really important to look at the kind of files that people are opening and what's really relevant. In most cases, a lot of your users will be opening normal stuff. If you have developers or engineers, something can obviously go a little astray for how they're using those machines. But it's always really important to kind of look at how things are working. So, and this is going to be related to a slide or two down, so we'll talk about this a little bit more. So if we look at the example of this latest CVE, and you were looking at your VMware endpoint solution, what you'd really be looking for is WinWord as a parent process spawning control.exe. So this is that run another app indicator inside of VMware endpoint. This is that invoked another application, or child proc, I think they also call it inside of the product, if I recall correctly. All of those are really clear indicators of threats to your environment. And if you think about that kind of process and how these are put together by the attackers, what you're really looking for is these commonly used malicious file names that are then spawning a process either for scripting or for something else. So in the case of this new CVE, we're looking for control.exe because it's spawning an ActiveX control. However, in the case of macros, it's going to be spawning a PowerShell script or PowerShell process, essentially, or it's going to be spawning a command shell process. And both of those are also really good indicators of, I'm seeing file names or file types, I should say, that are potentially dangerous, or maybe they're not, but they are spawning shells that will indicate something odd is going on inside this environment. So combining those two allows you to get a bit more visibility and structure into your environment just across the board. One of the other ones that is related to that slide are malicious HTAs, which over the last 2 years or so, VMware Endpoint, obviously Carbon Black Defense previous to that, was not amazing at detecting. However, they've done a lot over the last few years to make this a really, really good detection. So this is something that usually will get caught. And this is an HTA file, which is basically an HTML application file that gets loaded into mshta.exe, and that presents kind of like a web page to people. But the web page is a dangerous game, because that web page, quote unquote, can have PowerShell, it can have VB script, it can have ActiveX controls built into it. There's no real way, once one of your users spawns this, for it to stop. It's just going to run. There's no macro like click on this to say go. It's just going to go at that point. And all they really need to do is introduce a single file to your environment. And that file doesn't need to necessarily have anything threatening. It can just have something that spawns process into memory, which we'll talk about a little more later as well. But to kind of give you an idea as to where we see this and how this works, generally speaking, the attacker is going to send a phishing campaign out to all your users. And that phishing campaign these days is going to be one of two things that seems to work well. Harassment training or COVID training, one of those two. It'll drop them to a website, and that website usually will have a fake login, because if you're going to drop a file, why not also try to steal credentials? And that fake login will present an application that looks like what's being discussed, COVID, harassment, whatever that kind of thing is. But the main issue is the moment that file opens, you're going to see a very similar pattern to what we were just discussing in the previous slide, which is to say that HTA is going to spawn, it's going to open mshta.exe, and then that's going to spawn another process associated with it, usually PowerShell, to then execute into memory across it. So it's something that is really easy for the attacker to build. It's something that's really easy for the victim to accidentally just run. EDRs have significantly improved their ability to detect these kind of HTAs, but what I'm starting to see more commonly at this point is that some vendors like to package driver installs into HTAs. HP loves to do this. If any of you get detections for this internally, I'm sure you've seen the HP HTA that likes to come up for driver delivery. And what happens in some organizations, especially ones that are heavily focused on vendors that use HTAs, is that you will just kind of say, whatever, we're just going to push order the HTAs. We see this so often. I would recommend moving away from that pattern if you can, and moving more toward how can we have the HTAs that we know are safe, which is to say HTAs derived from HP, for example, whereas we aren't going to allow all the rest of the HTAs. They can be a really, really punishing file if they are allowed to run without controls and essentially safe listing associated with them as well. And this next one, script running in memory, is something that's really important from the standpoint of your EDRs. It's important from the standpoint of how you're interacting with your environment. And some of these can just happen because of how your environment is built, which is to say, if you're using an RMM or you're using any sort of remote management tool, this kind of detection will just happen. There's only so many ways for your RMM to hook into PowerShell or into WMI to actually execute the commands you're requesting of it. And generally speaking, they're going to have a process that's running, it's going to inject into PowerShell, and it's going to run at that point. It's not our favorite thing in the world when we see it happening, but it is an inevitability. And it's one of those areas where I think a lot of people like the idea of saying, well, we're just going to detect on when people bypass PowerShell's restrictions. But in many cases, a lot of these RMMs are already doing it, or as I'm sure a lot of people have experienced, it's just the inevitability of managing a large network where you start having to bypass PowerShell because signing PowerShell is such a heavy lift to implement the PKI required for just broadly signing your PowerShell. So making sure that you have tightly considered how your environment currently does this just inherently is really important as a first step of like reviewing your output from your VMware endpoint, looking at your any of your EDR logs to associate how you are currently interacting with scripts running in memory from any of your remote management solutions is a really good first step for determining kind of, is there a parent process that's pivoting? Is something spawning PowerShell or command shell that you want to? And if there is, how can you start to pull that noise out, safe list this kind of stuff, and be able to only focus on where the threats are in your environment? It's a really important step in the script running in memory, because it's just natural that people run things in memory with scripting at this point. It's the easy and sane way to do a lot of script execution. So it's also the way that attackers will also do it. So when you see detections that are, like I said, focused on bypass, or maybe they have IEX, which is shorthand for invoke expression, those are the situations where it's looking for those scripts being loaded into memory, especially in the case of PowerShell. And that can be run from a base64 encoded blob that's dropped in, or it can be brought in through a web client. And in either case, it's going to be running in memory, spawned through however that actual process is spawned. So you really want to ensure that you're capturing that information from your EDR perspective. You're leveraging your VMware endpoint to determine, is PowerShell being spawned? Is command shell being spawned? Do I have spawns that are coming off of parent processes that I either don't expect or I have never seen before? And really where you can start is, do we have an RMM? What is our RMM? How does that actually work? And then you can start to just filter those out inside of your actual EDR instance. The other thing that I always recommend is, and this can be focused on Carbon Black or not focused on Carbon Black, but generally speaking, ensuring that you have specific visibility into your PowerShell transcription and block logs is really important. There's a lot of visibility into the VMware endpoint side, so there likely will only be certain components that you're missing, but it's worth validating to ensure, am I seeing what I want to see out of this? And if I'm not, how can I expand my visibility into scripts that are got triggered inside of memory, scripts that are being run by users. Any sort of scripting process is really important to get more visibility into. And the EDR tool will significantly help here. And while there may be some bypasses, which is to say you won't get an alert for it unless you make sure you get an alert for it, at the very least you will have visibility into that occurring, which is a really, really important first step. All these are very related, so you're going to hear a lot of like interconnected theories here. So the unknown application component, so basically it's a part of VMware endpoint, it's a part of the just behavioral side of the EDR. You get the ability to know if this is a known application, what kind of application it is, like potentially unwanted application, like global whitelist kind of application. All of those are really important at being able to reduce the amount of noise that you have internally in your environment. It can increase the risk of noise at times because malware is generally unknown. So this is really important to kind of narrow down to your properly malicious behavior. And this may vary, and some of this may not be possible, as you'll hear me start to talk about. So when you're talking about things like process injection, where we were just talking about when something is able to have one process run and then inject into another process. So that these days you're going to see like run DLL 32, reg SBR 32, werfault.exe is also pretty heavily used. Those are really commonly leveraged by attackers to inject into another process. And it is something that you want to monitor for. You want to do what you can for it, but in either case, this is the point where a payload usually gets involved. So generally speaking, if your EDR is up to date, if it's configured properly, you can get some good joy off these kind of detections around someone is trying to drop a weaponized DLL and inject it in. I'm able to get a detection at this point. However, with the state of offensive security these days, especially with the prevalence of Cobalt Strike and the way that those droppers are created, it can be really, really hard for endpoint solutions to see this is a bad file, and you really want to start looking at the behavior associated with how injection is happening. And that's directly related to grabbing credentials at this point. Generally speaking, these days, no one is going to just drop a Mimikatz exe onto a disk and then run it and then take the files. It's all going to happen inside of memory, like we were just talking about in the previous slide. It's going to happen through injection. And in that case, they're injecting into LSAS to dump it out of memory to then take the credentials that are cached on the host. And that can happen through LSAS. It can happen through taking files through your shadow store, which is a really important thing to also investigate. Or it could happen through a number of other mechanisms. And this goes to what we've all watched happen over the last few months in Windows, where there have been more and more privilege escalation vulnerabilities. There have been more and more issues that just haven't either been patched or properly patched by Microsoft. So all of us are put into a situation where even in the case of like LSAS for grabbing credentials, it's really difficult for admins to guarantee that that machine can't be escalated to admin and then have those credentials dumped out, so long as you know that you have fixed like print nightmare, hide nightmare, and all the other kind of issues that have come out over this last few months. So it becomes really important to monitor how these sensitive services, potentially sensitive services, are being interacted with. The one I will throw out there, svchost.exe, is so heavily used from an injection point by valid applications. It's rarely worth the time to dig through it unless you have the time to kind of sit down and be like, I'm going to build a baseline for how everything uses SVC host, and then I'm going to move forward at that point, which if you're getting to that point in maturity is a really, really good thing to do. The other big one is DLL hijacking, which is a lot more common these days. And realistically, there's always a chance, well, that sounds more sure than it is, but there's a chance that you have applications on your host that are vulnerable to DLL hijacking at any point. It can be something that occurs through an update to the application, that someone messes up their code and they insert DLL hijacking vulnerability. It could be something that's just sitting out there, something you got uninstalled, there's still a pointer and it's just there. But realistically these days, what we see more than anything else, and this is related to an unknown application, is that attackers will just drop down known vulnerable versions of programs and leverage those to inject DLLs. So a really common ransomware tactic right now is to get a foothold onto that host, drop an old version of Windows Defender, it's like a year and a half, 2 years ago, which is vulnerable to DLL sideloading and hijacking. And then they will then essentially use that vulnerable binary, which most people that like this would not be an unknown application. It's a known and valid application, but it's a very old application at this point. Could then be leveraged to gain further escalation, further foothold into that environment. So you don't need to just wait and try to find something to DLL hijack. You can drop your own applications to then inject, to then get further into that environment, which has become a really common tactic by attackers to say, why wait and try to find something that's bad when we know that the system's going to run Defender a system anyways, and we can just drop a previous version on top of one that's there. And it's become or I should say, adjacent to what was there, because they don't have permissions to do it on top of just yet. So it's become a situation where the attackers are realizing, I can't drop an unknown thing here, but what I can drop is drop an older one that might still be on an allowed hash list, or at least still be signed by Microsoft, and I don't need to worry as much about someone detecting it. So at that point, you're really talking about more app control. You're talking about looking at what's actually running inside of that environment, and you're talking about determining what your current state is of your environment and then detecting off of that. But in either case, and what I really recommend at that point is trying not to chase the most complex detection, chase looking for the behavior. So that malicious behavior is really, really important. It's what we focus on here at Blumira, which is to say, if you look for malicious behavior, at times you'll find your RMMs. At times you'll see situations like we talked about in the previous slide, where you will detect that your RMM is doing something that looks kind of shady, because there's only so many ways to do these kind of things in Windows, but you'll realize, okay, we can safeless this and we can ignore this. But every single attacker will need to do these behaviors. Every single attacker needs to be able to either inject into process, get into memory, and hold on that machine one way or another. And if they need persistence, it gets even more complex from a behavior, for them, from a behavior perspective, because they need to get something either in registry, in task scheduler, somewhere that stays on that host that can then be brought back up. So these are all really good opportunities to defend and detect your environment that aren't just kind of like, well, how can I get to the most complex thing ever? You don't need to get to the most complex thing ever. If you're looking at WinWord spawning command shell, PowerShell, or now what we now know as control.exe, which it would be ActiveX, those three situations will defend you against most of those potential threats to your environment leveraging VMware endpoint or any EDR at that point, generally speaking. And the last of this chunk of slides I want to talk about is blocklisted applications, which are important and relevant to your general environments, especially from a accepted business use case, which is, of course, not the most exciting part of IT security and IT, but it is important that your users can conceptually understand that there is an accepted business use case for the environment, and how they should be using their machines is relevant to their day-to-day use. If that isn't in place and users tend to just do whatever they want, you always run into those situations where users will just do whatever they want. And that can be really tough from a security point of view. I understand why organizations do it. I totally get it. But from a defensive security point of view and a maturity, kind of like growing your security and maturity throughout your environment, starting to pull back use to accepted business use case is really, really important. Not only for blocking future use if something odd happens, which I'll dig into a little bit, but also for the sake of your sanity, your IT team's sanity, not having to just kind of chase things. And while there may be some upfront annoyances, it definitely becomes more worth it in the end. Which is to say, it's just easier to focus on things like, I'm going to block who this application was signed by. So a few years ago, a really common one would have been like uTorrent or torrent software. We still see it every once in a while, of course. It's way easier to just block the person that signed that, so long as, of course, not another fun Microsoft binary, than it is to kind of chase each hash associated with it. And generally speaking, if you can approach that from the viewpoint of, I'm going to block these this class of applications, because I don't trust the signer. I don't want them in my environment. And if I do, I'll handle it on a hash by hash basis. That will inherently make your environment just much more secure. I know it's not fun to deal with the PUAs and the PUPs associated with the detections that fall out of these EDR products, but it also becomes really helpful to your environment, and it allows you to kind of really deeply focus on how you can best leverage your environment just across the board. So we got a good question. Are there tools or processes that could deflect large-scale ransomware attacks from a hijacked public cloud? So generally speaking, these large-scale ransomware attacks, so the most recent one that I would point out in this kind of situation or world is associated with, like the Kaseya attack was a good large-scale ransomware, well, not good, but good example around where we were and what's happening in this world. A large-scale ransomware attack broadly requires one or two things. It requires a known vulnerability that hasn't been patched yet, or it requires a situation where people are going to be inherently insecure and they can't do anything about it. The ActiveX example right now, this latest CVE, is a good example of something that people cannot do anything about realistically at this point. You can ask your users not to open things out of protected mode, but all of us know that that is something that, like, I mean, you can ask your users to do anything. It doesn't mean that they're going to do it. So it becomes the first part of that question, their tools or processes, become really important associated with how can you best ensure that you're secure and that you're properly secure. Generally speaking, the way that I look at this is, from a tool perspective, visibility is going to be your number one, so you can get ahead of a large-scale attack, which is to say, are my users getting emails from a single user? Do a lot of my users have emails from a single user? Are they opening or clicking on emails from a single user? Proofpoint has good examples of this. So does Mimecast in regard to being able to do like large-scale detection against who I know before. Also has a very good example of being able to do this as well. And that's from an email inbound perspective. When it comes to like the Kaseya hack or exposed RDP, which is another area that large-scale ransomware does happen, because anyone who has exposed RDP to the internet, I have a few that I put out there for fun, just to watch the data. Those machines are being attacked constantly in regard to them trying to be logged in. So if you want to consider that also a large-scale ransomware attack, in either case, that puts you into a situation where really there are only two things that I suppose three things that you can be doing. The first is always going to be visibility. What's happening on this host? Is that okay? The second one is always going to be ensuring that there is additional layers of authentication or security on top of it. So it could be MFA, it could be something else, and that something else generally is going to be an IPS or a WAF. And I know that the world has moved away from WAFs over the last few years. Cloudflare WAF is a cheap, simple example of this. Azure has a good WAF now as well. GCP has one as well. AWS has one as well now. So they're getting more common. And a lot of these recent attacks, like the Kaseya attack, would have been halted by a WAF in front of that endpoint that was in those organizations' DMZ. It was classic SQL injection. It was a classic attack. And the same kind of process goes for a lot of those VPN attacks, which is to say, if you can layer in security, which of course we get back to the classic defense in depth, if you can layer in security, you're always going to be better off at being able to deflect those large-scale attacks and be able to keep your organization secure. Because realistically, ransomware attackers, the campaigns associated with them, they're getting better, but they still really require the same thing that they did previously. They require a vulnerability to get in, or they require some way to authenticate into your environment externally, or they require someone to act upon a file that was delivered to them one way or another. So in either case, it requires some amount of effort by the attacker, and those processes generally to ensure that you're deflecting them or securing against them are going to be heavily focused on security maturity, visibility, and how can you layer in more security. And you want to do it, of course, in a way that doesn't add more effort to your team, which has its own kind of fun nebulousness to it. But it is important to do all of those things, just generally speaking. Hopefully that answered your question. And just to kind of step through as we were kind of went through those few, I just want to step at the kind of stages again. As we just talked about, it's really important to see the behaviors from the discovery side all the way up to this exfiltrate data side. And generally speaking, if you're focused on behaviors, kind of like we were talking about through all these slides, if you're focused on a file that can spawn some sort of shell inside of your EDR, if you're focused on how those kind of files are getting into your environment, like HTA files, if you're looking at, and this is less related to EDR, but if you have visibility into how people are accessing things in your DMZ, or it could be in your cloud DMZ, it doesn't really matter where that DMZ is, and you know the state of your infrastructure in regard to how patched it is and where it is, a lot of these stages will be cut off by you as these attackers try to get into your environment. It is just inherently complex for an attacker to properly get a foothold landed if you're able to detect these things. So ransomware is never going to happen well, it can happen, but generally these days ransomware is not going to happen in 2 hours. Usually there's going to be initial access, they're going to confirm access, they're going to step away, and they're either going to hold that access for days to weeks to months, or within some time in the next weekish, they're going to then come in, get into the environment, and execute ransomware. And in those situations, often BitLocker, but sometimes malware-based across the environment. And realistically, at that point, ensuring you have visibility into how those things are being leveraged is really the most important. But equally as important is determining how each of those stages are impacted in your environment, which is to say, are you exposing RDP to the internet? Are you aware that you are? Is someone password spraying your environment? Are they trying to get in over through your VPN? Did one of your users open a Word file that spawned a PowerShell command line as well, or a control.exe in the case of the latest CVE? Those are all really relevant and really important, and being able to detect inside of your EDR or otherwise gain visibility become really, really important to deflect and stop those attacks across the environment. So of course, like I was just mentioning, detecting and preventing ransomware attacks early is of course the most important. You will rarely ever hear me, if you ever hear me on another thing, talk about how scanning is an important thing to detect on. The way that I look at scanning, and here's a fair example of it, is that if you were being scanned by a known threat recently, and by recently I mean like the last 48 hours, because C2s die real fast these days, or they're doing some sort of actual positive threat against your environment, which is to say, are they password spraying an endpoint? Are they doing an anomalous path, which would essentially amount to like enumerating paths on your web servers? Those kind of things are the kind of things that we want to look for in scanning. You don't want to look for someone who's just running a vuln scan against your DMZ. It will destroy you trying to respond to those. It's not possible to respond to all of them. And from an EDR perspective, you really care more about, did someone impact that host while they were doing all of the scanning, less than it is, did someone randomly throw nmap at my host, which is to say, like, that doesn't really matter. And gaining a foothold, of course, is the requirement for ransomware, any of these attacks. If someone hasn't been able to gain a foothold, you're not going to get attacked by them. And this goes back to, of course, was password spraying successful? Was someone able to get in over RDP? Why is RDP allowed at all? What are the open ports? And or how are people interacting with Word files, Office files, anything that can leverage a foothold into that environment. In general, in most environments, their only attack surface should be things like Word. If your users are getting still like SCR files or EXE files through email, it's time to block all of that for the sake of your sanity and give another process to them to get those files in. Making sure that they can be scanned, making sure they can be investigated before the person touches them. Proofpoint and Mimecast both do a really good job at this. Office 365 does a legit terrible job at this if you're using Office 365 only. Whereas, of course, you got your EDR solution to handle it at the end. But in the perfect case, as you see at the top here, You want to detect it as soon as possible. You want to respond as soon as possible. Something wrong with getting it at the EDR. You want to get it right at the EDR when it's spawning that PowerShell. You don't want to get it when it's 5 days into going through your environment and you see PSExec was spawned, and now that's where you are. You always want to try to move that back. So that has a lot to do with detecting on behaviors and detecting on kind of where people are and what those attackers really want to do. Let me just give you some more details about Blumira. We are, as I had mentioned, a threat detection and log aggregation company. This is more related to Office 365 Inbox, but this is how we kind of focus our detections, which is to say, Blumira only cares about relevant detections to an organization. If something isn't actionable, and I strongly recommend organizations take this tack internally as well. If something isn't going to be actionable to you, your IT team, your IT sec team, if you work alone in the organization you're at, you don't detect on it and make a report for yourself and review it on a weekly or monthly basis. It's really, really important that you focus on things that could be threatening to your environment or damaging to your environment from a risk, suspect, or threat perspective, which is to say, things like scanning from the internet are not necessarily a risk to your environment. Someone password spraying your environment is a risk to your environment. Someone opening a WinWord file that spawns a command shell is a threat to your environment. But someone opening WinWord that just goes out to the internet is not, because it does that often. So ensuring that you focus really heavily on what's important to your environment, what we do here as well, what's important to the environment, is it properly prioritized, what's the analysis associated with it, and then how do you actually respond to it. If you don't know how you want to react to the thing that you're detecting, it's always going to make it more complex for you to have to think about, well, I just got a detection that says WinWord spawned a PowerShell. Is that a bad thing? How do I get visibility? Do I need to do something else now? And all of those are things that you should think about ahead of time, either in tabletops or through playbooks that are built into products if you have them, like Blumira does, just for the sake of your sanity as they come across. Because no one, I think a lot of us have experienced that situation where you wake up at 3 a.m. and you have an alert that's a priority one bad thing happened, and you're just trying to get your brain back together, which is never a fun thing. So playbooks ahead of time for the sake of your sanity. That's what Blumira does here as well. And of course, just to continue the Blumira topic, we integrate with any service, and we are adding more every week. Of course, all the VMware solutions ranging from Carbon Black EDR, Endpoint Standard, Enterprise EDR, CB App Control. We like all of them. They're really, really good. Of course, that gets into ESXi logs, vSphere logs, VMware logs. Those are all really helpful as well to determine things like, how's your environment working? How's it going? We do support WatchGuard as well. Yes, thank you for the question. WatchGuard as well, although we could probably stand to add that on there, shouldn't we? We should add that on there. WatchGuard as well. We do support, among other technologies as well. We're adding more and more. So if you're interested, by all means, please reach out. Happy to talk and do whatever we can to help you all out. Happy to do whatever we can there. And of course, if you like a free trial, want to try it out, Blumira deploys in a few hours at the most. It's a really, really fast process to get up and going. It's a fast process to get logs in. Happy to go through this with anyone who's interested in taking a look at this. Yes, someone had asked, would this be a replacement to AlienVault? Yes, Blumira is a direct replacement to AlienVault. We've done a lot over the last year, as I'm sure anyone who's on AlienVault, as the AT&T transition has gone through, of moving people off AlienVault and onto Blumira. We somewhat selfishly think that we are significantly better positioned to help people than AlienVault because of how we focus detections, generally speaking. Any other questions?
I know you've been on top of the questions, and I've tried to keep along. Did you answer the question about WatchGuard?
I think I did, but I'll reiterate. We do support WatchGuard and its many log sources associated with it, among other types of firewalls. We have a good coverage of firewalls at this point, and we're always happy to bring on more and more. We do all parsing in-house here at Blumira, which makes it sound like it's like boutique parsing. But really why we do it that way is to ensure that you don't need to worry about how data is structured, what it is, how it works. All you need to worry about is how to get better visibility into your environment and how to be more mature. And by mature, I mean from a security perspective, but we can help you in other ways if you'd like help in other ways as well.
Great. I know we had a question earlier from Felton asking, is the presentation being recorded or is the deck available for download after we are done? I just wanted to let you know and reiterate that yes, this presentation is being recorded. The link to vmug.com/webcast/ pre-record or I don't remember what it is on demand will be sent to you tomorrow, and we will have the uploaded recording of this webcast there. We just got a question that came in from Paul asking, can you get into any of the tools you or your partners offer for ransomware impact mitigation if after an attack?
Sure, yeah. So after ransomware attacks is a hell of a time for most organizations. There are a few tools that we like to use, that we recommend using. Generally speaking, it would depend on where you are after an attack, which is to say, what is the state of the environment? Where are you going? How can that move forward from the perspective like incident response and how the environment is structured? Generally speaking, there are a few tools that we like and we recognize as being helpful and useful from the standpoint of kind of where we're going and how people are approaching their environment. FireEye has a number of good tools that we recommend for post-attack, at least that I recommend for post-attack. Memorize is a good one for determining what's in memory on that host, which is to say, if you're in a situation where you're trying to recover keys, you're trying to take an ability to kind of step through that environment and determine where the state of those hosts are, and not all your hosts are locked, because some of those, there are situations where you just will have no functioning hosts. Memorize is a really good tool for being able to pull out your live memory and find any information available inside of it. Redline from FireEye is another good one for triaging your host and determining what's going on inside of it. Realistically, what we recommend is two things associated with it, well, three things, I suppose. One, ensuring you have really good visibility before an attack. After a ransomware attack, people always have the best visibility they've ever had. It's just inherent of like when it goes wrong, then when you respond, you fix everything. But getting ahead of that with good EDR products like VMware Endpoint, rolling your own EDR visibility with it never hurts as well. So running like Sysmon with Carbon Black gives you that really, really, really in-depth visibility into your environment that you can at least then go back, if you're shipping all those logs off your environment with something like Blumira, and say, where did this come from? How did it start? Have we cleaned it up? Did we resolve the problem? Because really what we see these days, generally speaking, when it comes to ransomware, tends to be a situation where the environment is largely locked. They aren't able to move forward at that point, and they need to kind of figure out how to start. And the worst case is that you have no data backing up any of that, and you can't go back and determine how it started. Because realistically, I don't care if you pay the bounty or not, if you haven't determined how it started, and you don't have historical visibility into it, so that you haven't built out your tool set internally to get that visibility, it will just happen again. And you really need to ensure that you started with that visibility and you have the ability to kind of look back and introspect and say, here's how this started. We know it came through this IP because we did not patch this VPN, the SonicWall VPN, let's say, that was sitting in our DMZ that we forgot about, which is just kind of a natural growth perspective. But when it comes to just your inherent tools and how you built your stuff, what I really would recommend from an after ransomware impact would be check your Hyper-V, check to see what is still left that's not encrypted, check to make sure that your backups are being properly handled. If you're using Veeam, make sure that they're off-site and they're uploaded every night or sooner. You can get lucky every once in a while, and the attacker will forget about the Hyper-V stuff that's been sitting. They'll forget about snapshots, and those situations can take what was going to be a very long recovery and turned into a much faster recovery. But FireEye, like Memorize, does have a good set of applications and tools to use post-incident that you can use for your IR and you can use for any sort of needs associated with that. Looks like we just got a question on FedRAMP certification. We are not currently FedRAMP. I mean, I have some internal comments on FedRAMP certification, but that probably isn't necessary for this call. But FedRAMP in general is something that we're looking at doing. Blumira doesn't currently store its data in a GovCloud, so we are not currently FedRAMP certified. However, it is something where we're continuing to take feedback on that, and if we have enough people that are like, we'd really like you to have FedRAMP certification, and we'd like you to push into GovCloud, it's something that we'll be looking much deeper into. So if you're interested in that, please reach out, and we will continue to talk and get that on our list. So we got another question. What value does Blumira have versus a common EDR for ransomware? And the way that I like to present Blumira is less of a specific focus on solving one problem for you and more of a, if you've ever had, I mean, if you've used a SIEM before, which I'm going to guess a lot of us have on this call, you probably used it, been frustrated by it, and were annoyed by the fact that it just didn't give you anything you wanted. And what Blumira does is instead taken data from a large volume, just variety of data sources. So that could be a common EDR, it could be VMware endpoint, it could be Sysmon for just a free EDR, it could be any of the EDRs out there. And what we try to do is ensure that leveraging each technology can give people the best visibility into threats into their environment. We really like combining Sysmon with another EDR because then you get the benefit of that EDR signature-based detection with the ability for Sysmon to get that really, really low-level information on that environment. And the value you get at that point are things like really nebulous detections that you probably wouldn't want to sit down and write, where Blumira and my detection engineers do, which is to say, like, the ability to detect how our clone ships data out. Blumira enables that detection through, we can do it through Carbon Black, we can do it through Sysmon, we can do it through a number of different ways, but what we also do is give you the ability to also have detections of, like, we'll go back to the WatchGuard example because it was brought up, also be able to see a detection of, like, your WatchGuard shipped over 5 or 50 gigs of data over the last 30 minutes, also from the IP that was triggered associated with this threatening behavior. So it's really more associated with Blumira provides value across the board for your environment, and we try to do it in a way that is best for you and doesn't just burn you out. Because the moment that you are burned out as IT or IT security professionals, it's much harder to respond. So it's really focused on what's best for your company, what's best for you, and how can we help you become more mature. And that could be with a random EDR, it could be with Sysmon, or it could be with VMware endpoint. But either way, it's around supporting that process for your organization.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. Matthew, I was just wondering if you had any last things that you'd like to push out to our audience.
No, it was great to talk to everybody, great to answer questions. Always excited to get a chance to ramble about all these things that I like to talk about. Please check out Blumira if you're interested in anything around our detection logic. On our blog, we also will post any of the ways that we're doing detection for any of these kind of like new CVEs or any sort of threats that are coming out. So like check it over the next day or two and you'll see even more around like how you can detect for like the latest active XCV. So any and all area things, we are always happy to provide more information on.
Well, thanks so much, Matthew, for joining us. And I have to say thank you to our audience for asking so many great questions. I'm sure, Matthew, how was Q&A? Come on, pretty great questions, right? Isn't it
great? I love this. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to just sit here and answer questions all day. So by all means, it was great.
There we go. Well, as Tom just sent in, he sent in a big thank you. I have to agree with Tom. Thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us today and taking the time to speak with us. As a reminder to our audience, you will receive a follow-up email with the on-demand link from today's webcast. To find out more about the VMUG Webcast program, visit vmug.com and check out the webcast page. Please make sure to complete the short online evaluation that will pop up as I end this webcast, and let us know how today's session went. I really appreciate if you fill out the quick survey that pops up. And from all of us here at VMUG, thank you, and have a great rest of your day.